Welcome to Why the Long Face? Two old friends lifting the lid on mental health over a beer with author and psychiatrist Paul Keedwell and business consultant and so-called comedian Ollie Turnbull.
I'm enjoying a Sauvignon Blanc. I bet you're good at ordering wine, aren't you? I'm just rubbish.
Oyster Bay is the most famous mass-produced Sauvignon Blanc
Pile of
you
crap.
can get.
Oh, really?
No, it's good, isn't it? It's good for a white wine. I'm a red wine drinker, so any white wine, as far as I'm concerned, is a bit shit.
Oh no!
But I'm enjoying a Co-op Rioja. 2015.
So suggested by the Co-op sommelier.
Guess
when
what?
You came in. He said, "What are you going to be eating tonight, sir?" I'm eating peanuts and pie. Oh, in that case, have you tried the?
Yeah, we tried the product of Spain. Just in case you didn't know, Rioja came from Spain.
I knew that.
It tastes all right.
I really don't get it.
It was on offer for
a lot of my
reason.
mates have been on these wine courses, and they look at the menu and go, "Oh yes, no, that sounds great." And I know nothing about wine. I like most of it. Have you got to the point where you can look at a menu and go, "Oh, I'll have that"? No, yes, that's a really good year. Or if
Nope.
you do that, you're bluffing.
No, I don't even bluff. Don't even bother.
So I think all you need to do.
I'll just go. I like a Rioja. That's usually reliable.
Exactly. So
if I go for French wine, I quite like it, but it can be unreliable.
Yeah,
I can always
nice.
rely on a Rioja or a Malbec from Argentina.
You sound like an expert already.
Well, one thing I won't do is go for a Malbec from Chile.
Who's going to do that?
What kind of loser does that?
I've no idea.
A Merlot, maybe.
Yes, of course. You see, you sound brilliant.
Anyway,
Right.
we are going to talk today about loss, which is actually quite a big subject. But a loss can be any loss, really, can't it?
Yeah. So you're familiar with the Holmes and Ra stress scale, are you? Presumably, is it?
Stressful life events.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, because the top one is divorce, isn't it?
Death of a spouse, mate.
Well, that's a loss.
Ah.
And so is
right.
a divorce. Yeah, so the top ones are losses, aren't they?
Yep. Always.
Divorce is second, isn't it?
Incredibly, divorce is second.
Right.
Marital separation, imprisonment, death of a close family member is below that, which is surprising. Personal injury, dismissal from work, and these all get a life change unit score.
Yeah.
And it starts at 100 with death of a spouse.
It's a great illustration of when we're talking about loss, we might be talking about different types of loss.
Yes.
That lead to a bereavement reaction, and in some people might lead to depression. And I suppose the ep's about normal grief first, and then how we distinguish that from someone who might suffer from a depressive illness after a loss, right? Is that the point of this?
Exactly right. That's one of the main points of that. Exactly right. Some of it is a normal reaction, and some of it is something that could be described as clinical depression. Although, as we have said before, you can consider depression.
Wag your finger at me.
I was not at you. I was wagging my finger in some
Like you were giving
very good. Like I was giving a lecture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or at least a seminar.
I am so gammon these days.
No,
I don't
you're
know if you
fine.
noticed. You think?
Well, no, you're gammon at rest. We've established that. But, when you wag your finger, you get even more gammon.
Under
You get
laboratory
ultra.
conditions we've established.
You
to
become
gammon at
ultra
rest.
gammon.
Ultra gammon. The gammon ultras. It's like PSG.
You go from
ultras.
slightly pink to
I
through a
said
range
before.
of lobster red through to purple.
Yeah, and I start saying things like, "I think you'll find," and it's not as simple as that. And you haven't changed a plug before. But what the point I was making was that although the cycles of grief, which we'll go into in a minute, are normal, your premise also is that depression itself, although horrible and clinical, is also a natural reaction to stress events. So it's
Oh, well,
a
that's
kind
where
of
it gets
grey
all.
area.
So it gets a bit complicated. Yeah. If we go back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, depression is one of those stages. So she came up with this in the 60s, and people have since then reassessed this, thought, well, okay, people don't necessarily go through these stages in a particular order, and you may not get all the stages of grief. But her point would be, yeah, that's okay. But you need to be aware of these different stages of grief, so that when you're going through it, you don't think you're going crazy because this is normal.
Well, let's dive in. The 5
So,
stages.
What your first stage is?
Denial.
Denial.
No, it isn't.
It's not my favourite stage, but it's quite a good stage.
You've got a favourite stage.
I
I know what your favourite stage is.
What is it?
It's acceptance, man.
No, it's not.
Spoiler alert, though. That's the 5th one.
Yeah. No, it's not. But I'll tell you what my favourite one is when we come to it.
Well, it's got to be bargaining then.
Yeah, it's
Anyway,
bargaining.
spoiler
It is
alert.
bargaining. It is bargaining. Your phone's going.
No,
Turn
that's
it off. So denial then, you get the call, someone says, your mate Pete's died, he fell off a roof when he was roofing.
And it's
He's
like,
dead.
no way. I spoke to him
And you're
yesterday.
like, yeah, I spoke to him yesterday, and went, you're lying to me. You're lying to me, I'm not having that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever had that, because I've had losses, and actually I didn't have that, but what I did have was the kind of numbness, the kind of, when because it goes along with that initial shock thing.
Which is a protective thing,
And I think, well, definitely.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't have that, you wouldn't be able to get on with things, would you?
Yeah.
And that can last, 5-7 days longer in some people. Yeah. It's that feeling of slight unreality.
You know that thing where people go, I expect them to open the door and say, hello, I'm home.
Yeah.
And they're not there. Is that sort of a symptom of it? You're still in your reality. They still exist. Your spouse.
Yeah.
You're waiting for her to come home.
I think that's right. I think that's and you can cycle back into that denial. We have our funerals usually 7 days after the death, don't we?
Well, and in some cultures a lot sooner than that. So in the Islam faith, I can't remember how quickly it is, but it's very, very quickly after the
my
death that they-
my sister's father-in-law died recently, and the funeral was fairly soon afterwards, and I was just very, very aware. I didn't know him that well, but I felt very much for my brother-in-law and his brothers, because they started for the first time kind of processing the fact that he's definitely gone.
Which is why we do this ceremony, I guess. The religious man often, or someone who's respected, or woman, says those words. You see the coffin there. It's all very physical. I remember my granddad. It wasn't a tragedy. She was very old, but we were all very sad. And to see her there, it was quite a shock for me because I'd never been to a funeral before.
Right.
But it was useful. There's a nice sentence here which says, "There is a grace in denial. It's nature's way of letting in only as much as we can handle." I quite like that. That's quite nice.
Yeah.
And it talks to some of the things you've talked about regarding depression and the fact that there's a sort of valve, if you like, which protects us from overload, if you will. And that this is quite a nice, elegant sentence describing what that.
As the denial gradually wears off, perhaps it becomes more and more challenging for us to deal with our emotions, and maybe feelings would be much more overwhelming if we didn't have that initial kind of shock phase, numbness phase.
So phase 2, is it?
Phase 2.
Oh, let's do it.
Is anger.
Yeah, you do phase 2.
We know this is another necessary stage of grieving. I suppose it's that realization as the denial wears off that this person has either left you or this opportunity has left you and it ain't coming back. And that hits you with anger. I think it's sort of a bit of a rage against this injustice, if you like. It's like, how, or why me? That kind of thing.
My grandmother lost her husband very young. He was 50, and she was still cross. And she wasn't cross with the situation. It sounds comic in a way, but it's not. It wasn't for her. She was cross with him.
Right.
She always used to go, "Why could he leave me like this?" I remember even as a child thinking, "Well, it's worse for him, Gran." But I never said that, obviously. But
he's dead.
Yeah, exactly. And
yeah, you can be absolutely furious with the deceased. Or in the case of a marital breakdown, or you're not ready yet to accept your part in that, or the fact that maybe just people are not compatible and they separate, which might come later. At that stage, you're like, how dare you do this to me?
Yeah.
How dare you have this affair, or leave me, or decide, or just out of the blue decide you're going to have a divorce? That's outrageous.
Yeah. And people of faith, of course, sometimes their anger is directed at their God.
Yeah.
Where's God in this? Why has God let this happen to me? I don't understand. I know he is ultimately universally wise, but I can't see. He's moving in a very strange way because he's making me so miserable.
Yeah, because I've lost my loved one.
Yeah.
It could be your child could have died. I mean, that's extremely difficult to handle. How is that God's will? Whoever the object of your anger is, it's a defence against your own pain, isn't it? If someone punched you in the face, you'd be pretty angry with them.
Yes.
And that's a physical pain, but you're feeling an emotional pain and you're reacting to that in the same way.
Well, it's an affront, isn't it, as well as the physical pain? You're thinking, hang on, how dare you? How could you possibly think that you have the right to punch me in the face? I mean, many of the time I wanted to punch you in the face, but I pulled back. I pulled back because of your anger.
Well, also because I'm from near Coventry.
And you'd come back windmilling in with those.
Exactly, from the School of Hard Knocks.
Quick limbs of yours.
So, yes, quick limbs, but not necessarily accurate limbs.
Well, no, you went for the numbers game when it came to.
No, I just went pretty good self-defense, which is a whirl of fists that don't connect, but no one comes near me.
That was going to be your when you were going to do that martial arts movie. It was just going to be a whirl of fists.
Yeah, that's right.
Was that your Red Indian name? Careful, calm down, whirl of fists. No, I'm going to get him. Sorry.
Yes.
What comes next?
Well,
it's your favourite, man.
well, I had a system here which was pretty simple. I was going to just be angry at something or someone.
Yeah.
And at some point, that anger turns into a kind of, I can't be mad at you forever. Maybe there's some way of getting you back. Oh my God, I'm pining for you. And is there any way, can I pray to God to get you back? I was angry at God a minute ago. Now I'm praying at God to get that person back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could just have 2 more days with her.
Or if it's a breakup, it's a kind of, or let's compose.
I'll change.
Or I'll compose that text message or that email in the probably forlorn belief that that's going to persuade that person to come back to you. And it is my favourite stage. I mean, it is quite insane, this idea of praying to the Lord to bring this, in a supernatural way, bring this person back to me.
Well done for completely dismantling 90% of the world's believes in religion there, Doctor.
Well, I think even the most ardently religious person would accept that this is a stage of grief and not a realistic.
That's quite a good answer. That's quite a good answer.
It's not necessarily the case, even if you do have faith, that you believe that God can intervene in some way. I would never try to argue someone out of their faith, because I think it's very comforting for a while, and that bargaining with God might serve a purpose. An important part of bargaining that we haven't mentioned is the if only.
Right.
Which is self-blame, which I think is possibly a step towards depression, or the stage of depression, which is, I'm responsible, this is my fault. It's no less true than the anger stage. My brother-in-law wouldn't mind me saying this, but one of his brothers had real guilt for not coming back from his travels in time before his father died. As if that would have, in a way, that's a form of bargaining. If I'd come back in time, maybe he wouldn't have died. No, he still would have died, and it wouldn't have made any difference to how he died, probably.
No.
And in fact, they said, well, his father probably would have been angry if he'd come back just to see him die. He was like, no, you're young,
most people would
live your life.
Want you to go and live your life.
Yeah.
If they truly love their children.
That's right.
People do.
Which he did.
Ah, poor guy. I hope you explained that to him, and I'm sure you did very
well.
Very
I tried. Everyone did, but I didn't really need to intervene that much, because his brothers were really good as well, and it was all about them supporting each other. You know, they'd waited all day by his bedside, and eventually they sort of went, right, well, let's go and have some food, and that's when he died. And that was you know. But the guilt is very common, I think, at this stage.
So what's very interesting in what you just said is that I always thought depression, and we're giving it away what number 4 is, depression followed bargaining because the bargaining wasn't working. What you're saying is there is another way that depression can follow bargaining, which is when you come to the conclusion through your bargaining that there is something you could have done, should have done, etc. False as it might be.
Well, Kubler-Ross would have said, after bargaining, what is happening is our attention is moving squarely, as they put it, from the past into the present.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So it then, because bargaining is about pining for the loss, it's about negotiating, God, please bring this person back, or maybe there's something I can do, that thing of it's my fault, but I can make this better if it's a relationship breakup, that kind of thing. So then there's a realization after a certain natural pause, your brain has just worked it all through in a sort of very anxious, manic way, into then going, that hasn't worked.
Yeah.
And, they're not going to come back. That's not going to come back. That person who's died or left me, that's not going to,
So it's a little bit like learned helplessness. The experiment that we've mentioned in previous episodes about the dog, where you deny them
That's
food
an interesting one.
and they suddenly at the end of it go, there's nothing I can do. My mother isn't going to return. My husband isn't going to return. Or
that is pretty good, actually, as a way of looking at it. Yeah, I've tried really hard. I've tried to work through a way. You knew really all along in your heart of hearts that this is not going to be reversed.
Can I ask a question which is slightly tangential? But can you go through these stages in a lot less, with a lot less pain and a lot quicker for any kind of loss? And now I remember in 1996 going out to Germany in the semi-final of Euro '96, having beaten the Dutch in the group stages and the Scots, and then we beat the Spanish in the quarterfinals. And I'm sure I grieved. I'm sure I bargained. I'm sure I got depressed, and I'm sure I eventually accepted it. And that was a stupid football game. Is it true that you can, for relatively trivial life events, go through this same cycle? Obviously not grieving as much, but still the same.
I suppose it's the same with the Holmes and Ra life events research. The limitation of that was ignoring the individual and the personal meaning for an individual of a loss. And in your case, in that situation, most people might laugh at the fact that you went through the stages of grief, right?
Yeah, but we were so close. Gaz was like inches from getting that goal. Surely you remember.
You'd obsessed about it for months, right? And it was a really important thing for you. But let's come back to that, because we're at a very important, controversial stage, as we said, of the grief process.
I know where you're going with this.
Well, depression is a recognised mental disorder, but the stages of grief are excluded from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual and the ICD as a mental disorder. Grief and the depressive phase of grief is regarded as a normal process.
So let me get this straight for our lovely listeners on all continents of the earth, by the way. I've just done the research.
Yeah.
You are making a distinction between clinical depression, your area of expertise, and the depressive phase of a natural grief cycle.
I would make that distinction, but it's a great battleground for psychologists. As we said at the very start, not everyone goes through all the stages, and not everyone goes through all the stages in this particular order, and people oscillate massively.
Yeah.
They can go through all 5 stages in one day and then back again.
And go back again. Wow.
But the depressive phase is really about going, I'm feeling really sad now because I'm properly processing what's going on in the present, and it's that transition from harking back to the past in the bargaining to transitioning towards how am I going to cope in the future.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's
right?
really elegant.
But
like
during that phase, it is absolutely normal to experience a lot of the symptoms that you might experience in a clinical depression, and that's why it's very difficult. If someone, for example, came to see you as a doctor or a therapist in that stage of grief, what do? Do you go, oh wow, you seem to have all the symptoms of clinical depression. Maybe you should treat you for depression. Maybe we should even prescribe an antidepressant. But you could hear the weight of the American Psychiatric Association. No, this is a normal process. You have to let it ride. But most psychiatrists would say this is a matter of length and severity. So some people would say, well, if you're going through a depressive phase at all, maybe you're already depressed. I don't really buy that.
No.
But if they came to me and said, yeah, I've been stuck in this phase for 3 months, I'd be thinking, okay, well, let's ask a few more questions. And the sorts of things that might indicate more of a clinical picture would be feelings of worthlessness, quite severe weight loss, really slowed up. Because actually, I think in a normal grief depressive phase, you're not necessarily, really retarded in your movements. You're not. I think you've still got the ability to sort of be to a degree animated. But I think really extreme, what we call psychomotor retardation, where someone is almost stuporous, that would indicate a clinical picture, and hopelessness and suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
So if the suicidal thoughts are pretty strong, I think clinically you have to do something about that. People get fleeting thoughts that life's not worth living during depressive grief phases. But if someone is thinking, we did a whole ep on suicide, and we talked about gradations of intent, and that's what you would need to assess in that situation. It's never going to be black and white, but if someone is actually thinking about ending their life, then that seems to me a common sense indicator that this isn't a normal grief process. There's something else going on here, and we'll come to your example of Rich later. And pathological guilt. We've talked about normal guilt that you might get during the bargaining phase, but if you're doing the depressive phase, you're absolutely convinced that you're, the cause for
Got it.
this loss.
That is brilliant. A brilliant passage because it, for various reasons. One, it distinguishes between depression that is part of a natural process and depression which is clinical. So I think that's fascinating. One thing though, and on an optimistic note, is that one thing that stuck in my mind about what you said before about the depressive phase of grieving was your preparation for acceptance. And do you think in a clinical setting where there is no loss associated, also try and use that model, by which I mean is a depressive episode which isn't caused by loss, but is caused by some other event or is something that you can't necessarily put your finger on, can it be framed in the same way as a phase in your life or a phase in the way your mind is working, which can lead you to some form of acceptance?
Yeah.
And as a therapist, is one of the many things you do, try to lead the patient towards that.
Yes.
That the sunrise, if you like, of acceptance.
When you lose something or someone that's important to you, maybe that's echoing the time when you were admitted to hospital for a couple of weeks and you weren't allowed to see your mum, or that kind of thing, where you were abandoned or had a sense of abandonment in a childlike way of thinking when you were younger.
So this is my favourite part. This is my favourite part.
Oh yeah, your favourite stage?
My favourite stage is acceptance. Because
that's a cop out, man. Of course, everyone's favourite stage is
Well,
acceptance, 'cause that's where you want to get, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's like chill, and it's just like, oh wow. But one thing
is it chill?
Yes, exactly. So before I say that, it's not to be confused with
feeling great,
right? Or feeling okay, exactly.
Or feeling great about the loss. For the rest of your life, you're going to carry a loss. Maybe you're going to go through all 5 stages again at the anniversary of that loss in a year's time. But it is that point of life is for the living, you got to move on. Or in the case of a relationship, there's more fish in the sea. In the cold light of day, having processed it all, it's a much more philosophical stage.
But as you say, it's not necessarily the end. And it's not to say that you won't go back, maybe with less intensity, to some of the other phases.
You know when you're going into the acceptance stage, because the good days start to outnumber the bad ones, but it doesn't mean you don't have any bad ones. Yeah. I think you wanted to talk about a specific example, our friend Richard, who lost his sight. So it's a different kind of loss to the losses we've sort of alluded to so far.
It does.
It's nevertheless still a loss.
Yeah, and a couple of weeks ago I spent a long-ish time on the phone talking to him about it. So this was a gentleman that both me and Paul know, Richard Lane, wonderful fellow.
A top chap.
Yeah, a top chap, a cricket lover, a music lover, a violinist, a raconteur, a wine lover.
More cultured than me or thee.
Christ, yes. And yes, of course. Hailing from the fine town of God, I've forgotten. It begins with B. Bedford.
Birmingham.
No, God.
Bedford.
No, the fine
He's from
town.
Bedford.
He's from Bedford. Yeah.
Oh, I've changed my opinion.
He went to Bedford Grammar.
No.
The one of 2 grammar schools that he tells me in Bedford. The other one, Alistair Cook went to. So he loves his cricket.
So the famous Alistair Cook went to the other one.
Yeah. Can't remind you.
Which is absolutely typical of his self-deprecating style. He's a very, very bright chap and very funny.
Very bright, very lovely. But when I was living with him in 1991, age 24, he was 24, he lost his sight. He lost his sight completely. So from not having the greatest eyes, he went to not being able to see anything.
So he had a connective tissue disorder, which particularly affected his eyes. And his retinas effectively detached themselves, didn't they?
Periodically, and then famously, permanently.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He's got quite bendy fingers too, which we think is the same sort of thing.
A completely different experience from being blind at birth, crucially, right? Yeah. So then having to massively adjust to that loss, which he adjusted to quite well initially.
Well, so it's really, really interesting, and this is why, we bring up the example because it's one that we know intimately, but also it relates to what we've been talking about. So I believe that although it was a horrible shock, and he talked about what's the point in going on, as he would really, one wonders whether what he was going through was actually clinical depression. certainly in the early days, weeks, months. And I'm wondering whether actually he didn't. He was going through grief as you would imagine him going through it.
Well, you said before you thought the depression came later.
Exactly.
That this was a sort of phase of grief that you'd expect, which is, oh God, what's the point? I mean, this is awful.
Yeah.
But not to the point where you'd think, no, I seriously want to end my life, right?
Correct. I mean, there were a couple of times down the pub after a few drinks where I thought I will probably check in on him.
You're a good lad.
But he's a resilient guy. He's a resourceful.
You're good checking in.
And bless you. But the other thing about Richard that make him very resilient is not the fact that he is inherently resilient, but he loves life.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a massive thing which helped with him coping with this thing. He loves life. He loves
But also,
food,
did he have
people, he has friends, he loves dinner parties, etc.
Right. But also, because of that, he presumably had lots of friends who loved him back and were supportive, very supportive of him, or not?
Exactly. 100%.
In the early, right,
100%.
Because I think that makes a huge difference to how you cope with loss, is how much support you get around it, and how that really affects the outcome, and how quickly you can come over it.
But interestingly, he described when I talked. That's exactly right. He described when I talked to him a sense of guilt. Now, isn't that interesting that someone who's lost their sight feels guilt?
Well, I can get that. I can understand that. It's different to normal loss because you've developed a dependency.
That was it.
You become disabled.
Yeah. He said two things. Oh my God, I'm going to be an imposition on my friends. And oh my God.
Which is not necessarily true at all.
No,
what isn't true.
Was willing.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, and I feel like I've let my father down. Which
Good God.
Almost brought a tear to my eye, because it's like, certainly I knew his father. He's passed away now, but I knew his father. And of course he would never have felt that. But it's a funny father-son thing. His mother had passed away years earlier. That you feel you've let your father down by something that's completely out of your control. And that was one of the things that...
well, I suppose that's a reflection of the generosity of the guy, that he feels that. But,
yeah,
it's extraordinary the sorts of irrational thoughts that grief throws up. But the important thing to remember, certainly in the early stages of reacting to a loss, is that you can have all sorts of crazy thoughts, and this is part of the process.
And I'm wondering whether, paradoxically, the fact that he suddenly went into a program of training organised by the RNIB kind of ironically helped in a way, because he had something to concentrate on. He had to learn Braille, which was hilarious, because he's got a great booming posh voice, which when he swears is hilarious.
Right.
I can't understand these fucking dots.
Right.
He's funny. So that was quite good. But he had these things to go through that was outlined for him by the RNIB, and I think being occupied in becoming a skilled blind person actually helped in some ways with him putting himself through. But he also said that he was vulnerable to depressive thoughts, if not clinical depression, because his energy levels would go down, because he had to learn all these new skills, feeling his way around the flat that we both shared, rather than seeing his way around the flat, which added to the exhaustion. So there's a double whammy going on, and I'm learning all this stuff at the same time as coping with the fact that I've got a massive loss.
I remember my mother, when my father died, going, "Oh, I'm going to have to sell the house." So there's a bit of a kind of panic that goes on, where probably during that bargaining phase, or the, I don't know, at some point during the initial reaction, which is a bit catastrophic, and and I remember having to persuade my mother that actually, these ideas that she's not going to be able to cope with all the roles that my father did in the running of the house was unrealistic, and in any case we can all help. And we had a bit of a rotation system for a while, but I mean, in reality, she had a large garden, but it was possible to hire a gardener to go in every now and
But
again.
imagine how overwhelming that is. I mean, imagine having to cope with grief, loss of your father, who was a lovely man, I remember him, and being overwhelmed by the practicalities of the things he used to do around the house. Poor your mum.
But going back to Richard, then, what was really difficult for him, of course, was being reminded of his blindness and bumping into stuff, and that's a double whammy. It's like, oh, for God's sake, I was getting used to having lost my sight, but now I've just kind of hit my head on something. It's like a really rude kind of reminder of
He
it.
said that. He said exactly that. It's like not only, it's like an insult to injury. It's like I'm blind, I feel useless, and bang! My head really hurts because I've twatted it on something that I didn't know was there.
Right.
His words, not mine.
Which is dark, very darkly comic.
So he's just past the point where he's been blind for longer than he was sighted. So he's 50 this year. So we're talking 26 years ago when he went blind. He still has that bang when he trips over the curb and twists his ankle a little bit. Or
Really?
Even
Even
now?
now? Yeah.
No, absolutely. And he goes, "Oh yeah, you're blind." And he gets a little bit of...
So most of the time he's absolutely fine. He's got his guard dog and he's able to get around, and but every now and again.
Yeah. It says...
I presume it's unavoidable. Occasionally you're going to tweak something, or
Yeah.
you're going
Yeah.
to get your balance wrong.
Yeah. But people talk about that in depression as well. Who suffered from depression. Sometimes they have a bad week or a bad couple of weeks. And it's just depression tapping them on the shoulder saying, "Remember me? Just manage me."
So I remember you saying about Richard, which we should probably just mention quickly, that he seemed to go through the normal stages of grief to acceptance, but then got a delayed depressive reaction.
Right, exactly. So
Where he actually was prescribed antidepressants because he seemed to have all those symptoms of depression.
exactly.
Right,
So a
that we
year or
talked
two
about.
down the line, it was almost like a very long honeymoon was over. He was blind still, and he will be, unless there's some miracle in science, which actually is not completely inconceivable.
No.
And he was doing great. He's back to work. He's back in the real world. And then suddenly, all these thoughts start to take over his mind. So he was always, he did well with women. He had many relationships. Women liked him. Everybody liked him, really. Still do. And he found himself struggling socially. And he found himself thinking, why on earth? Because I think having a relationship with a woman was important to him. Why would a woman want to take on a blind man? He started to get a bit introspective.
Didn't he have a bad experience with the RNIB as well?
Well, the RNIB is a wonderful organisation, but it doesn't fit everybody.
Not the organisation specifically. It was a particular experience. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to knock the organisation, but I remember him
Not at all.
saying he went along to an event, a cricketing event or something, and there were people there that were blind from birth, and they had some particular individuals, I think, just had an effect on him because they were sort of implying that he wasn't properly, but he was a different category of blind. He wasn't properly blind, simply blind from birth.
Right. That's right.
It's actually arguably worse. that he
Strange
lost his-
snobbery going
Yeah.
on. There are, and I don't think this is a general thing, and I hope people who are listening who are blind don't take offence, but in his experience there were two communities: the blindness from birth and the people who had
So that was a
become blind.
contributory factor, but also
Maybe.
there were ongoing difficulties perhaps that he hadn't anticipated initially. And I often think that we need to look at the difference between an event, like a partner leaving or death, and something that then is a consequence of that event, which actually may be unforeseen or just, but the point is that it's particularly protracted and difficult. So to use an example of the divorce, that's acrimonious, and then there is a custody battle over the children. So it's not the event itself that leads to the depression, but it's that ensuing battle that's over time, which is what we all talked about. It's this sort of, I think that what leads to depression usually is a sort of relentless stress.
That's a thing I hadn't even thought of before, but that's exactly what happened.
And the same
to
thing
Richard.
could happen with a death or a loss of sight. That you're left with these chronic life difficulties that you possibly didn't anticipate.
Say a partner dies and leaves you in incredible debt. Because they,
Horrendous
I mean,
situation.
imagine that.
Much more difficult then to process the loss and deal with it in a normal way. So we talk a bit about helpful ways in which people deal with grief.
No. This is not a helpful podcast. Yes, of course we should. Absolutely.
No, maybe we should end up with things that you can do to prolong your
To
grief,
make yourself worse.
or to just get stuck in denial, or in bargaining.
In perpetuity.
Although that's a serious point because some people get stuck. But this definition of the normal time span for grief is bizarrely and hilariously wide. It's from 6 months to 3 years.
So forget it. Don't even talk about it.
So
Do you know what I
probably
mean?
pointless. But I suppose it's down to how much you're suffering and how well you're coping. It's like anything. When we define a disorder, we're talking about an inability really to function. So I guess if you're stuck in grief to the point where you can't stop breaking down in tears, talking about the deceased or thinking about the deceased 3 years on, then maybe you should go and see someone. If you can't work, if you can't have a relationship, if you can't move on, I mean, I would say after a year, if you can't move on, year to 2 years. Because it really depends. I remember a vicar coming round to our house.
Why is it when you say a vicar coming round, it's just funny? That's just inherently funny. It's a vicar coming round to the house is inherently funny, whatever the situation.
Oh, vicar. Yeah, well, he came round for tea after my father died. But it was incredibly comforting. And he was a great guy and so skilled. But I remember him saying to my mother, this is going to take some time to adjust to, and it's probably going to take a couple of years. People said, oh yeah, normal grief reaction is about 6 months. Well, no, because if it's a woman in her later years who's been married for 40 years and loses her husband young, it's all relative. I'll talk about some coping mechanisms she had. So she threw herself into Friends in Retirement. She did a lot of charity work. She started inviting people around for coffee mornings and for kind of quilting sessions. I don't know what. So ways in which people cope. You might build a memorial, video clips, maybe a website, maybe a scrapbook. Things like that can actually help. Writing a letter to the deceased. If someone dies of cancer, you might work for a cancer charity or set up a new fundraising event.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I would never dismiss the work of people who work for organised religious groups.
I remember we had a chat with Steve Coogan once. I met Steve Coogan, right?
Wow.
And he went on to later to make the film Philomena. And I didn't realise that the discussion we were having at the time were probably formative and part of what he was going through to write the script.
You should have got a credit. You should have got like an exec producer credit on the film.
I was robbed.
Are you still pissed off with him?
Yeah, he's got no respect. So lovely, actually great guy, quite serious. And I remember him talking about this, and he was saying, yeah, I agree with you. Why would you want to argue someone out of their faith when that faith helps them get through loss and adversity and all those things?
Quite right. And I think actually it's a sort of intellectual arrogance to try and do that. Personally, I don't believe in God, but I don't know.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. That was pretty good. I think we nailed most of loss. Have we got any take-home messages?
Yeah, we do. So the take-home messages, as I've recalled them, are as follows. 1, loss often results in the 5 cycles that we discussed. There is a difference between the depressive cycle and what we might call clinical depression, although there are similarities, which means that the way that you would...
There's an overlap.
Yeah, an overlap indeed, which means that the way that you would help someone in the depressive phase of loss, there is some overlap with the ways that you'd help someone who is clinically depressed.
There's a process you go through, but it doesn't mean you're going insane. It doesn't mean that you're going to be like this forever. I think it's the important thing, right?
Beautifully summed up.
But don't be afraid of seeking professional help, I guess. Right?
Right.
We'll see you next time.
You betcha.
Hey, thanks for joining us on Why the Long Face. As ever, we're here to inform, hopefully, and entertain, but we're not here to give you medical advice. There is, however, information on our website, ytlf.com, that's whytlf.com, about where to get help. See you next time.